Good afternoon, everyone. It is so wonderful of all of you to trudge out here on this rainy day. So I appreciate that you are here today for this, the 27th, plus or minus one, hashtag COVID, annual John and Barrett Ford Lecture. So welcome, one and all. I am Julia Marchiari-Alexander, and I'm the Andrea B. and John H. Laporte Director of this great museum, the Walters Art Museum. And again, thank you so much for being here today. Before we begin today's program, I would like to acknowledge the histories that have led us to our present moment by reading the Indigenous Land and Cultural Heritage Acknowledgement of the Walters Art Museum. The Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations that originally inhabited this land. We also acknowledge tribal nations, most notably the Lumbee, who migrated here, and the indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects we steward in our collection. Today, our program, Korean Ceramics, The Great Tradition, is part of, as I've already mentioned, the wonderful annual John and Barrett Ford Lecture Series. This series began, as I said, circa 27 years ago, and over time has provided this institution and our visitors with many opportunities to invite internationally recognized scholars to present free lectures with presentations with a focus on Asian art and all aspects thereof. On behalf of all of the staff and our Board of Trustees, I want to say a special thank you to the Fords, who are here, as ever, with us in this auditorium. Thank you, John and Barrett, for everything that you do, for your generosity for this lecture series, but also for all of the wonderful works of art that you have given and that you have pledged to this institution, as well as your expertise, generosity, and friendship. Thank you so much, John and Barrett. One of the great fun joys of my time here at the Walters every year is to talk to the Fords and see who they think should be the next Ford lecturer. And they are always interested in bringing just wonderful and fun people whose expertise is incredible. And today you have a great treat ahead. This year, the Ford Lecture, in addition, is a capstone of this week of programming that we have had in conjunction with the opening of our landmark installation across Asia, Arts of Asia and the Islamic World. We opened that last week on the 4th floor after nearly a decade of planning and many years of incredible work to bring out objects, many of which have not been seen in a long time, and certainly they have never been seen in the kind of installation that our terrific curators who are here today have put together for you. This installation enables us at the Walters to tell a broad range of stories from across the Asian continent, and visitors can now experience work from across Asia, not only in that space, but also across the museum. We continue to enjoy the Nepalese, Indian, and Tibetan art that is featured in the Ford Gallery and has been there in some way, shape, or form since Hackerman House opened in 1990. So that also is coming up on a 35th anniversary soon. But you will also be able to visit the 4th floor of this building, and in visiting both of those installations, you are able to learn a broad range about the arts from South and Southeast Asia, East Asia, as well as a broadly writ Islamic world. Today's lecture, we are highlighting a couple of our Korean ceramics that are featured in the newly redesigned galleries just upstairs. And I very much hope that you will be inspired after this lecture to go see them today. Following the presentation that you will hear about in a minute, our speaker will open the floor to questions for you during a brief question and answer, and we will ensure that everyone can hear by asking you to wait to have a microphone. So we are filming this, so it's important that you wait for the microphone so it gets on tape. And then we can ask the speaker to speak to your question. So please wait for the microphone before you start to ask your question. And lastly, after the program, I invite you to join us at a reception in the lobby on level 1 for some cheer, some food, drink, and really a salute to our speaker today and also to the Fords. And then after you get some sustenance, please do visit our galleries upstairs. Today, I would like to welcome Dr. Annie Proser to the podium to introduce our speaker. Annie Proser joined us in May of 2020, so that was an exciting moment for the museum and also, I think, for her, moving in the midst of COVID. But Annie Proser is our Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Quincy Scott, Senior Curator of Asian Art. Annie.
Thank you, Julia. It is such a great honor for me to introduce Robert D. Mowry, the former Alan J. Dworsky Curator of Chinese Art and head of the Department of Asian Art at Harvard University Art Museums, and also senior lecturer in Chinese and Korean art in Harvard's Department of the History of Art and Architecture. Among his accomplishments at Harvard was publishing in the field of Korean art and building a collection of Korean paintings and ceramics for the Harvard Art Museums. After receiving his BA with a concentration on European art history, French, and medieval humanities at the University of Kansas in the late 1960s, Bob spent 2 years in Korea in the U.S. Peace Corps as a volunteer. The experience motivated him to do graduate work at the University of Kansas, studying with Chu-tsing Li and Lawrence Sickman and specializing in Chinese art. During that time, he spent 2 years at the National Palace Museum in Taipei, and then he spent most of his career at the Harvard Art Museums. But he took a break from Harvard to serve as the founding curator of the Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III collection at the Asia Society in New York from 1980 until 1986, and I was really fortunate to be one of his successors there and benefited for all the great foundation of research and other work that he did at Asia Society. Bob has published extensively, and I'm not going to go into all of the details, but he's published in the fields of Asian art in general, and more specifically in Chinese and Korean fields. One of his best-known publications, Hare's Fur, Tortoiseshell, and Partridge Feathers, Chinese Brown and Black-glazed Ceramics, 400 to 1400, is a catalog of a 1995 exhibition that pioneered the scholarly study of Chinese black and brown glazed ceramics. And that is a kind of Bible that I have been using since its publication as well. He has had a profound influence on our field, and we're so grateful to him for that and his many other publications. Since his retirement from Harvard in 2013, he's been serving as senior consultant in Chinese art and Korean art at Christie's, where his role is to do research, publish scholarly articles, give lectures, educational staff seminars, and consult on works of art. From 2013 through 2017, he served as the editor of the National Museum of Korea's scholarly journal, Korean Art and Archaeology. Please join me in welcoming Bob Mowry tonight, or to this afternoon, to talk about Korean ceramics with great tradition.
Thank you, Ani. Good afternoon. It is a treat to be with you in Baltimore, and it's a great pleasure to be with all of you. Thanks for coming to this discussion of Korean ceramics, which is a very important among the world's ceramic traditions, but until recently, it has been a tradition very much neglected in the West. So I'm happy to share these thoughts with you. Now, of course, first I want to thank John and Berta Ford for the invitation to give this lecture. It's a signal honor. I've known John and Berta for decades. Berta, of course, was a little girl when we first met, but nonetheless, we've known each other for decades, and it is a pleasure and an honor to give this lecture. I also want to thank Julia, Ani, and the rest of the museum staff for hosting the lecture, and I want to congratulate my old friend Ani Proser. She was an even littler girl when we first met, and Donnie and the rest of the museum staff on the wonderful Across Asia installation that opened just last week. What a wonderful thing. Now, like any good art historian, I have brought far more slides than is anywhere near reasonable, so let's jump right in. I don't expect you to go away with a full knowledge of Korean ceramics, but I do hope you will go away with a general idea of the development of Korean ceramics over the, I would say centuries, but nay, millennia, and with the idea that you see the major pieces contributed or made during each of the several periods that we will look at, but also how each of those pieces technically and aesthetically paved the way for what would come in the next period. Now, since we have way too many slides, we'll jump right in, and to get through them all, I will try to explain things, but in some cases, I hope you'll forgive me if I take a somewhat here's this, there's that approach, so we do get to the end of the lecture. Now, I think everyone in this audience realizes that Korea is in Northeast Asia, with China to the west, sort of a parenthesis that is Japan over there. The line that you see there is the 38th parallel, which since the end of World War II has divided the peninsula into North Korea and South Korea, as you see over here. I'm hitting the wrong button. So that's the geographic setting. Now, this is a short list of the Korean dynasties. We will look mainly at the Three Kingdoms period, particularly some ceramics from the Shilla period. We will look at the beautiful, some pieces from the Unified Shilla period, the beautiful celadons from the Goryeo dynasty, and blue and white and other ceramics from the Joseon dynasty. Korea's list of dynasties is mercifully short compared to China's endlessly long list of dynasties, but here you have the basic background. This is a quick overview of what we'll be seeing. We'll be seeing the technologically sophisticated unglazed stoneware pieces from that Three Kingdoms period, beautiful celadons from the Goryeo period, and blue and white and other wares from the Joseon dynasty. This is the same map here, but when we talk about the Three Kingdoms period, there were three major kingdoms, the Goryeo kingdom in the north, the Shilla kingdom in the southeastern part of the peninsula, Paekche there in the southwestern part. Kaya, some people want to call the Fourth Kingdom, but it was actually a confederacy of small states rather than an organized kingdom with a central ruler. Goryeo was the most powerful militarily, but it was not the most productive artistically. The most artistic ones were those in the south, and we will look basically at some ceramics from Kaya and Shilla. So the ceramics from the Three Kingdoms period have not largely survived above ground. What we know of the period comes largely from materials excavated from tombs. In many cases, large tumuli or tomb mounds, like the ones that we see here in Gyeongju, which was the old capital of both the old and the unified Shilla kingdom. Now, these are royal tombs in Gyeongju. They have not been excavated, but other tombs have been excavated. Korea in early periods was exceptionally rich. Many people in the West have the mistaken impression today that Korea, because of the Korean War, because of the MASH television program and things like that, that Korea was impoverished. Well, maybe it was impoverished towards the end of the 19th century, but throughout much of its history, it was a very wealthy nation, as signaled by the gold crown here. And then not only gold crowns, but Look at the beautiful earrings. Now, of course, these would have been very expensive in their day. They would have been worn by members of the royal family, perhaps other very wealthy nobles, something like that. But it gives some insight into the wealth of Korea in those early days. It was in the Three Kingdoms period that Buddhism first made its way to Korea, from China and then into Korea. And so in the Three Kingdoms period, here, this from the first half of the 7th century, we have extraordinarily beautiful and important Buddhist sculptures. Now, as I said, most of what we know about early Korea, apart from the Buddhist materials, but with the ceramics, it comes from tombs. And it's not like they were one ceramic here, one ceramic there. When the tombs are opened, everything is often jumbled, as you see here. We'll look at pieces of this type individually in just a second. But you see the circumstances when they were excavated of what things looked like. Now, this is very typical, a so-called covered pedestal bowl or cup from the Three Kings period, probably 5th, maybe early 6th century. These wares are unglazed. They show little aesthetic or stylistic influence from China, but a great deal of Chinese influence is coming in during this period. We see it in Buddhism, but this is also the period when the Koreans were adopting the Chinese writing system. All kinds of other influence was coming in as well. The influence that's present here is a technical influence. This is stoneware. That in the next slide, yes. There are 3 basic types of ceramic ware any place in the world. Whether it's the ancient Americas, whether it's Europe, whether it's Asia. The lowest fired is earthenware, fired at a low temperature. You're all familiar with earthenware in your own homes. A red flower pot, not a vase, but a flower pot for a growing plant is earthenware. It is low fired in the range of up to maybe 800 degrees centigrade. And because it's low fired, it is porous. You know that if you overwater the plant, the exterior of the pot will be moist to the touch because of the capillary action of the earthenware pulling the water out. Okay, the Chinese were the first to create stoneware, which they did actually already in the Shang dynasty by, say, 1400 BC. But even though the Koreans came later, the Koreans were the next peoples in the world, anywhere, to create stoneware. They learned probably clandestinely from the Chinese, but the Korean learned to do it. It is a very difficult thing to master the high kiln temperatures necessary to produce stoneware and other high-fired ceramics. You think, well, they were producing bronze early on. Why couldn't they produce stoneware? Other cultures, not just Korea. Think of it this way. The basic problem with a kiln is like the fireplace in your living room. How do you make the heat go out into the room instead of just going up the chimney and out? That was the basic problem with kilns. The Chinese solved it. Not long later, Koreans solved it as well. The Japanese learned to make stoneware from Korea. So it's in this 5th, 6th century period that the Koreans are able to make stoneware. Japanese, more or less, the 6th century, and the rest of the world will be far behind in producing ceramics. Now, porcelain uses 2 very specific white clays. When they're fired, if the walls of the porcelain are thick enough and the light is bright enough, light will be transmitted through it. And of course, it's completely non-porous. The Chinese invented porcelain, as we will see during the course of the lecture. 8th, 9th century, that general period. Koreans were not far behind. Keep in mind, the Koreans were the next people after the Chinese to be able to produce porcelain. And the Koreans were producing porcelain by the 11th, 12th century. The next peoples in the entire world to produce porcelain were the Japanese, not until the 17th century. The Europeans in the 18th century, and the poor old Americans not until the 19th century. So you see on that technological ladder how technologically advanced the Koreans were. Now I mention this because a particular culture or civilization's ability in mastering high temperatures in a kiln is a mirror of that country's general level of technological development. So it shows you that the Koreans were not only masters of producing ceramics, but there was a high degree of technological sophistication there. In fact, throughout the whole world, the Koreans were right behind the Chinese in terms of being at the top of the technological sphere. So that's what these ceramics tell us. Now, looking at ceramics from Korea from the same period, they don't look as advanced as Chinese ceramics, who were already using glazes. But keep in mind that to have glazes like the Chinese had, the Koreans or anybody else had to first master the production of stoneware. Because if you want fine celadon glazes, or if you want porcelain, you have to be able to reach the high kiln temperatures. That's what they've mastered here. So now these pieces tend to be set on a high perforated pedestal base, whether it's a bowl, whether it's a covered food cup, or even whether it's a jar. They're actually light gray. Were, God forbid, you to see a chip or a big crack, you would see inside it's a very pale gray. But with the smoke going through the kiln during firing, many of them take on a dark skin like this. But it's just a skin achieved in firing. This one is in the Walters, a jar that's currently on display in the galleries. And you see even the jar is set on a high perforated pedestal base. We don't know why, it was just the taste of the day. And we see it over and over. Some of the pieces like this jar in the Walters are completely undecorated. Others will have some, usually geometric type of decoration, a little bit of cross-hatching or a little bit of zigzagging, something like that around the neck. And in some very rare cases, there may be pictorial decoration, such as the horses. They may look like zebras, but they're horses that encircle the shoulder of this particular jar. That type of decoration on these pieces would be incised. So after the piece had been shaped, but while the clay is still moist or leather hard, they would incise the decoration and then firing it. And that's the result. Now, some of the most impressive pieces from the period are these tall stands, like that one or like this one. They are made, obviously, for religious offerings. They're put in tombs, but we don't know exactly how they were used, what they contain, probably some type of generic wine that would be equivalent of beer or something like that, a fermented beverage, not a distilled beverage, that would go in that and would be an offering, presumably, to the spirits of the deceased. Now, the reason these are so impressive, they stand around 3 feet tall. Is that when you're firing something like that, it's so easy in the high temperature of the kiln needed to fire stoneware for the piece to slump a little bit or to warp, to lean to one side. But most of these are perfectly straight, as you see there. So it's not only a testament to their ability in reaching the necessary temperatures, but in able to control everything so that you get pieces like that. Now, another characteristic that we see already in early Korea and continues throughout the Korean ceramic tradition, not only the taste for the open work that appears in the bases here and will appear in other parts of vessels later, as we'll see, but there is an interest in producing vessels in sculptural form. So we don't know what this was for. It must have had a unique function, but it's some type of vessel to dispense a liquid, whether it's holy water, quote unquote, whether it's to pour wine for use in ceremonies honoring ancestors or such, I don't know. But you see there's something of an egg-shaped body there, which is completely hollow. There is a spout here for dispensing the liquid, and then there's the funnel-shaped device there at the back of the body in which the liquid could be inserted into the piece. Now, of course, it's in the shape of a dragon. And there you see the S curve of the neck, the mouth is open, the tongue sticking out, the spikes along the spine. And then notice the little dangles, integrally fired with the piece that surround the body of the piece. That, of course, is an influence of metalwork. And there was a close association, particularly of vessels in gold or silver or even bronze with the ceramic tradition. Or you look at this one, and this is also a kind of ewer, a pouring vessel. A hollow body there for the horse, the spout here, and the funnel-like device there for putting the liquids into the piece. Now, when you look at this, you think, oh, like a Tong horse, something like that. Well, we're beginning to see aesthetic and stylistic influence coming in from China in the ceramic tradition, alongside the technical influence. But a Chinese tomb figurine, a horse or an equestrian figure, first of all, it would not be closed. I mean, it would be completely sculpted, but the underside would be hollow. You could reach up inside of it from the bottom. The Chinese pieces were not vessels. They were funerary figures representing a horse and rider, whereas this is a vessel. Again, it's high-fired, but it shows this interest in vessels in sculptural form. Now, we're leaving that early period. We're leaving the Three Kingdoms period and moving on to unified Shilla. Excuse me, in the 6th century, Shilla had a completely overpowered Kaya. In the first part of the 7th century, it overpowered Pekcha and absorbed Pekcha. And then, in 668, through an alliance with Tang Dynasty China, oops, I keep doing that, Shilla conquered and absorbed Goguryeo. Now, unified Shilla did not claim all of that territory. This was the area of unified Shilla up into what today would be North Korea, but another part of it became a separate kingdom of Pade, which was an important kingdom, but not artistically so significant. Now, the big things that happened in unified Shilla, again, we're talking about 8th, 9th century, Buddhism becomes the state religion. Buddhism had come in during the Three Kingdoms period, but it is the state religion, meaning royal patronage in the building of temples. And so you get magnificent temples like Fulguksa, of which this is just the wonderful, the bridge, if you will, up to the terrace on which the temple sits. Or this is a cave temple of the type that we had in India and we also see in China. The difference is the stone in Korea, when you see these mountains, they're not limestone like the hills into which cave temples were excavated in China. These are of granite. You cannot excavate a cave temple into a granite hillside. So they wanted a cave temple in the model of the Chinese, so they built it with blocks of cut granite. But this is a cave temple, and there you see the very distinguished sculpture, the distinguished architecture with the dome. You don't see it here, but the dome as part of it that rises over the Buddha. Now, when we look at ceramics, there's still the unglazed stoneware. There are splashes of natural ash glaze that form during firing because of ash falling onto the pieces during firing, but it is accidental. But you see the pieces are becoming full and round in the nature of Chinese Tang Dynasty pieces. The bases are becoming much shorter proportionally than before, and the number of openings is decreasing. One little open work window there, if you will. Or this jar, much the same, but no tall base at all, and no openings in the base. And so, this shows the progression of the type. In terms of decoration, a new type of decoration is introduced. Instead of incised decoration, like we saw before with those horses on the shoulder of the jar, they're using stamped decoration, where instead of stising, they just use a stamp over and over in the moist clay. There's that one in the National Museum of Korea, or this one, this wonderful jar with stamped decoration here in the Walters and on view at the moment. A very handsome piece indeed. Like I said, we're going to do a bit of here's this, there's that. Now we're leaving unified Shilla, but the things that I've told you are really important for what's coming up in the succeeding Goryeo dynasty. When the Goryeo dynasty begins in 918, is fully established in 935, with the capital in Kaesong, today's Kaesong, just across the 38th parallel into North Korea. The capital had been down here, it's moved up there, and that's the land expanse of Goryeo. That line there simply indicates the boundaries of Korea today. Now, just as Korea was very rich during the Three Kingdoms and Unified Shilla period, so it was very rich during the Goryeo period from the 10th to the late 14th century. Some of the most beautiful Buddhist paintings ever produced were produced in Korea in the 14th century, as you see in that beautiful image of Kwanseum Bosal, or in Chinese, Guan Yin. And these become the sort of archetypes of the Goryeo dynasty in terms of the arts. The beautiful painting and then the celadon glazed ceramics. Now, talking about Korea being very rich, in the palaces in the capital, there were some pavilions that had celadon glazed roof tiles, of which you see fragments there. Now, even in China, they didn't produce Celadon glazed roof tiles. They had glazed roof tiles, but they're low-fired roof tiles with low-fired glazes. These are expensive to produce, and so the Koreans produced them, hinting at the wealth of the kingdom. But even in China, you didn't see that. There was the end of one of those roof tiles there. Now, the influence for Celadon ware, Celadons were, they had 1,000 years of development in China in this general area. Shanghai is up there. Shanghai wasn't even there during that period, but in this area below Hangzhou Bay is where Celadons were pioneered. Because Korea was so wealthy, Korea, of course, had maritime trade with China. Koreans were buying the best Chinese products and taking them back for use in Korea. So when we talk about Celadon ware, what is it? Well, it has two different meanings. The popular meaning just refers to the color. It's a pale bluish green. The more technical definition is that it's a high-fired glaze, the chief coloring agent of which is an oxide of iron. You use it, you have the right conditions in the kiln, and you get a pale bluish green color. Now, this is a Chinese piece from the 10th century. They tend to be undecorated in that period, and the glaze is very, very thin. So you can imagine when the Koreans taking that as inspiration, and the Koreans were producing the Celadons basically in this southwestern area, not for any political reasons, that's just where the best clays were for producing Celadons. This is, now I'm skipping the period of general development. This is something already mature by the mid-12th century. And some of the earliest of the Korean Celadons were undecorated, relying on the beauty of the glaze and the tautness of the form for their aesthetic appeal. Or look at this wonderful cup and cup stand. The forms are Chinese. It's a matter of the Koreans adopting, adapting, assimilating, and then making their own. So that in this period, it's a period of learning. It's like Picasso learning by drawing ancient sculptures, that kind of thing. And once he completely masters it, he moves on and makes it his own. The Koreans will do the same. But here they're in this period of mastery, learning from China. Now, keep in mind, it's not just the Koreans. Absolutely nobody else in the world except the Chinese could do something like this. Couldn't even come close in the 12th century. Koreans were very fond of not only of sculptural forms with vessels, but of sculptural forms that imitated shapes in nature. So you get a calabash or double gourd, like we see in the You Were There, or here, and this one has incised decoration, a maebyung vessel, it's a storage jar. Maebyung means plum blossom or plum vase. It's a later name, it's a 19th century name. 19th century, sometimes they would use it as a vase for a cut branch of blossoming plum. But in their day, they were storage jars for wine, vinegar, soy sauce, whatever. But even here, they've segmented the piece, so it suggests a melon. And they, in addition to the incised decoration, they also have wonderful carved decoration, as good as or even better than what we see in China. It's hard to see it there, but when we tip this little bottle up, it's a little cosmetic bottle for cosmetic oils and such. You see the fluidity and the delicacy of the carving there. Now, this piece is in the Philadelphia Museum. It's difficult to see the carved decoration here. It's subtle. You have to get up close to it, which I allow you to do here. And you see the wonderful carving of that lotus blossom right there, or the lotus leaf down here. If you get a chance to go to Philadelphia, definitely see that piece. Now, also on the shoulder, but rotating a little bit to the left, I will show you this hibiscus on the piece. There you see the full open blossom, the hibiscus blossom. There you see the starfish-shaped leaf, and then down here you see some buds. But the delicacy of the carving, the absolute mastery of the technique. They also did molded decoration, as you get a hint of there, but you see full face when we tip the bowl up. Again, it is blossoming hibiscus decoration with the blossoms, the starfish-shaped leaves, and probably buds tucked in there as well. This falls into that category. This is very popular in the mid and late 12th century, that roof tile end again. And here we really begin to see the taste for forms in nature coming into play. It's a ewer, possibly for hot water, for preparing tea whisked tea at the table or possibly for warmed wine, but in the form of a clump of bamboo. Or here is one, same function, but in the shape of a bamboo shoot. All of these coming from the second half of the 12th century. This one's really fabulous. It is what the Chinese call a tuolong, and the Koreans a taoyong. It is a combined tortoise and dragon. So you have the tortoise shell, you have the dragon head, and then the whole thing set on a lotus blossom. But again, the Chinese probably could have done this, but they didn't. These things become uniquely Korean. So I said they adopt, adapt, assimilate, and then make their own. And here they have completely, in terms of these forms, made it their own. Or look at this incense burner. The top lifts off, this part lifts off. It's not for joss sticks or anything like that, which would have been used in temples, but there would probably be some ash in the lower portion of the container. And then on that, they would burn fragrant substances like sandalwood or other mostly imported substances. Then as it burns, the smoke and fragrance would come out the lion's mouth. But what a delightful piece. Or look at this brush rest for the scholar's desk. Very small. It's about this tall. It's about this wide. But there you have sculptural form with the dragon's head. But you also have the open work with the lotus arabesque here. Again, something far beyond anything that the Chinese were doing at this time. Again, Chinese being master potters to the world, it's not that they couldn't have done it, but they didn't. And in fact, the Koreans did choose to do it, and there you go, and you see what mastery they achieved. Or this really elaborate incense burner. Again, the top lifts off, the incense would have burned there, and the smoke and fragrance would have come out the open work ball at the top. Now, many of you know about Chinese imperial roux-ware, which was the most preferred ware at the imperial court in the first quarter of the 12th century. Well, obviously, that being the leading ware in China, the Koreans were able to copy it as well. Which is which without looking at the labels? Okay, this is one of the most famous pieces of Chinese imperial roux-ware in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. This is a Korean imitation of imperial roux-ware, so close in appearance and in its technical aspects that if you didn't know which was which, it would be difficult to distinguish them. That's in the Palace Museum, that's in the Rockefeller collection at the Asia Society. This is also copying imperial roux-ware. The reason it's such a square form and not decorated is that it was meant to go in a container like this. Again, it would have held hot water for preparing tea at the table, or it would have had warmed wine. And so the contents are heated, and then you put hot water in the basin to keep the contents of the ewer hot as long as possible. And so that one's in the National Museum of Korea, but it's the same type of ewer that we just saw a moment ago, but this one, sadly, has lost its basin. Now, again, I said there were relations with metalwork. That's true of all periods. Three Kingdoms period, Unified Shilla Korea. We don't have a lot of surviving metalwork, but this is a ewer and basin combination here in the United States in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And there you can see that influence of silver there. Now here, the Koreans have mastered all of that. They're creating a new technique of decoration that we don't see in China at all. You see this Myebyung vessel. It has incised decoration there, but look here at the top. You're seeing inlaid decoration. That is decoration inlaid in black and white slips. It looks like a little cloth of the type that might actually have been placed over the vessel when it was in use. Now, the vessel would have had a little bell-shaped cover. Most of those have been lost, and sometimes they would put a little cloth, decorative cloth, over the top. Now, this is an example where the whole entire piece is decorated with inlaid decoration. But what I wanted to show you is we don't know exactly how it was invented. We can guess, but we don't know for sure. Now, remember, from the Unified Shilla period, you have stoneware, unglazed, but it has stamped decoration. Then, so the first step in terms of inlaid decoration is stamping, like that. Then there is a tradition in China and Korea both of inlaid lacquer. That is lacquer that is inset with mother of pearl. The Chinese were doing inlaid lacquer like that. In the Korea period, Koreans were doing inlaid lacquer like this. And when you put them side by side, you realize that since they were already able to create stamp decoration, perhaps it was looking at contemporaneous inlaid lacquer and realizing, well, if they can inlay it with mother of pearl and other substances, maybe we can inlay it with some different kinds of clay. If you look very carefully, you see the decoration here are little chrysanthemum blossoms, just like the ones you get there. So one way or another, there's a relationship, whether it's a technical influence of inlaying or whether it's just a visual relationship, we can't say for sure. Now you ask, what is a slip? A slip is a clay, highly purified clay, that's ground to a fine powder mixed with water, and then it's a coloring agent is put to create the black slip. The white slip is more or less a porcelain clay, and then it's fitted into the hollows of the design. This kind wouldn't relate to lacquer probably, but probably also relates to the metalwork tradition. In this period, they were producing bronzes that had decoration inlaid with silver wire. And in those inlaid with silver wire, there was often a scene of a willow tree near a pond or a lake, as you see there, which is just what we see here. You don't really see the lake or pond, but if you look carefully, there's a little water bird, a duck or a swan or something like that, and the willow tree. And so, again, relationships with lacquer, metalwork, and such. If you're wondering, what does it actually look like before they inlay? Well, this piece was prepared for inlay, but for reasons we don't know, it was never inlaid and never glazed. But you see, the designs were all incised. The bamboo there, the geometric decoration there, and the brown that you see is simply accretions of dirt over the centuries. In some cases, the inlay fell out before the piece was complete, not after firing, but here, this piece in the British Museum, that area right there, I show enlarged here. The slip fell out of its intaglio lines before they put the glaze on, so that that area ended up with glaze on it instead of the white slip. But that, if you're wondering, what does this inlay look like? There you go. Now, in the beginning of the inlay tradition in the 12th century, that is in the mid to late 12th century, a typical decoration, floral decoration, or as we see here, cranes and clouds. In the 12th century, decoration tends to be, there's a balance between the decorated and the undecorated areas, as you see there, or as you see in something like this, in this wonderful Meyerbeung vessel in Minneapolis. Or you look at this piece in the National Museum of Korea, and it's not that there's so many decorative elements, but there's the big peony here and a large matching peony on the other side. When we move from the 12th into the 13th century, there's no longer a balance between decorated and undecorated areas because the piece gets fully decorated, as you see in this wonderful little box here. We tip it up and you can see it a little bit better, the chrysanthemums that are ever present. And then charmingly, the two cranes have their necks intertwined, as you can see there. In terms of the Meyerbeung vessels, the decoration stays about the same, the form stays much the same, but there's an increasing emphasis on the borders. For 12th century, you see really very small borders. Beginning of the 13th century, much more assertive borders, both top and bottom, and well into the 13th century, the piece is entirely decorated with these wonderful cranes and clouds. The ascending clouds in the roundels, and the clouds and descending cranes in the interstices between the roundels. They also did a few pieces with painted decoration, dipping a brush into, in this case, brown slip, painting it on the vessel, and then coating the vessel, in this case, with a very clear celadon glaze. Sometimes the brushwork can be quite wonderful and calligraphic, as you see there. But by the 11th and 12th century, Koreans were also beginning to produce porcelain under the influence of China. As I said, the Koreans were the next people in the world after the Chinese to make porcelain. Japanese, 17th century, Europeans, 18th century, Americans, 19th century. Once again, a testament to their level of aesthetic and technological achievement. Now, porcelain didn't become the be-all and end-all of the ceramic tradition in Korea or China when it was first introduced to the market, but it lays the foundation for what would come in the succeeding Joseon dynasty. This is another typical Korean porcelain piece you were in a basin. Now, when we leave behind the Celadons and the Koryo dynasty, move into Joseon, this is a type of ware called a buncheong ware. This is the tail end of the Celadon tradition. Whereas the best Celadon pieces had gone to the royal court and to wealthy Buddhist temples, lesser pieces, they were still expensive, but others outside the court and wealthy temples could buy them. But when we get to the Joseon period, porcelain comes to the fore as the most important ware at the court and other places. But the Celadon tradition doesn't die out. It lives on for a couple more centuries in so-called buncheong ware, as we see here. The Celadons had been produced down in this region. Buncheong ware tended to be produced in that central region, and the best porcelains were produced, don't have my glasses on, sorry, but I think, if I can see correctly, Seoul should be about there. The porcelain clay was basically in that particular region. So that's where they were produced. Now, what is buncheong ware? Instead of going through all of this, it was produced there in that region, and I'll just explain what it is. It's using the same gray stoneware that the Celadon had. They create an overall pattern like this, referred to in modern terms as a rope pattern, for lack of another designation. And those intaglio lines are filled with white slip. Then it's glazed. It's just that the glaze is thinner in application and it has less color, so that you see more of the gray stoneware body through the piece. May look gray, but it's actually a pale bluish-green Celadon glaze. And there's a detail of the rope pattern up there. Now, I put this in just to remind you of the little chrysanthemum heads and things like that. Here's another buncheong piece, and when you make the contrast, you realize that the design appears in a very, very orderly, planned way in the Koryo Celadons. In the buncheong ware, it is much more spontaneous in its the positioning of the designs, but still, they're little chrysanthemum heads, as you can see up there, and you can see how they devolve, for lack of a better word, from those in the Celadon tradition. Now, this is a very, very important piece here in the Walters. It's on display. In the upper portion of the piece, you see the rope pattern around the shoulder and neck, and again at the bottom. But a new technique of decoration there. Instead of just stamping something, they have very carefully carved out, not through, but just created an indentation or hollow of this wonderful peony design. Then they have inlaid the intallo area with white slip, and again, covered it with a very, very pale Celadon glaze. The reason I say it's so important, we have very few examples where we see this transition from the use of the overall rope pattern to the ones with carved decoration. We think it was probably that particular style, not the technique, but that particular style of decoration was probably influenced by contemporaneous lacquer. But then you move to something like this that lacks the stamp decoration and has the carved decoration inlaid in white slip. Then they realize, again, much of this, keep in mind, it's not only wanting to produce beautiful pieces, but the efficiency of production. These are not one potter producing one pot or whatever. They're factories, they're manufactories. They want to produce beautiful pieces, but the whole point, from their point of view, is to make a profit. So they're always interested in efficiency of production. They realized instead of all this carving, stamping, this and that, they could simply coat the entire piece with white slip, and in this case, incise through it. So you get a beautiful fish swimming along there. That you are seeing in the linear portions. You're seeing the underlying gray stoneware body against the white ground. Or then they realize, hey, we can paint designs on the surface. So you get the same type of design with beautiful fish painted. They will still sometimes incise through to create a very emphatic border design, as you see there. And sometimes those with painted decoration can become quite humorous, such as this wine flask with a bird grasping and carrying this huge fish between two giant lotus blossoms rising up there. So they sometimes have a certain whimsicality about them, but they can be very, very beautiful, as you see there. Now, leaving that entire tradition behind, the Celadons, the Puncheng ware, and moving fully into mainstream Joseon dynasty, that's to remind you of the general taste during the Koryo period. In the Joseon period, they move away. It's still wealthy in this period, in the 15th century, the beginning of the dynasty. But there is a major shift. There's a shift away from Buddhism. They're adopting the Neo-Confucian philosophy from China. They're closely allied with Ming Dynasty China, which began just a few decades before. The Ming Dynasty began in 1368. The Joseon Dynasty began in 1392. So they modeled themselves, the government, and even much of the aesthetics on the Ming Dynasty. The preferred color was not the beautiful celadons, the richly decorated bodhisattvas and such. It became white as a symbol of purity and such. And so now, of course, as we'll see, there's blue and white ware and such produced in the Joseon Dynasty. But some of the most interesting pieces are pure white, occasionally with a sky blue glaze, as you see there. And so you put those, and I showed you the Bodhisattva and the Celadon Maebyung vessel. These you might take as your lasting image of Joseon Dynasty. And it wasn't just in paintings like that, but many people wore, like this gentleman from, 1885, wearing a white robe. Or here's a street scene in Busan from 1904. Very different from China, where everything was so colorful. Now in Korea, of course, in the royal court, there were royal court robes that were very colorful and such, but every day was much less colorful than we see in China. Now, as I said, the Koreans had learned to make porcelain already in the Koryo dynasty, 12th, 13th century, that general era. It finally came to the fore. I mean, the Korean king must have said something like, if the Chinese emperor can have porcelain on his table, I want porcelain on my table. And fortunately, having learned to make it, the potters, in a different area, but the potters were able to produce it. This is a Chinese piece, porcelain piece, from the 15th century. This is a Korean one from the 15th century. Like the imperial roux-ware, looking at a slide, you would not really be able to tell the difference based on pictures. This is a beautiful little flat plate of a type that's pretty much uniquely Korean. Here's the same type of plate with underglazed cobalt blue decoration, which they're learning to paint in cobalt from the Chinese. Put them side by side, you realize it's the same kind of plate, but now with a floral arabesque painted in underglazed cobalt blue. Of course, they're looking at the very finest Chinese imperial court wares from the early 15th century. Now, mind you, when this was produced, the Chinese have had a century of development in producing blue and white wares, of learning how to, it's not easy. Clay is such an absorbed medium. If you try to paint with wet cobalt on it, it's not so easy to do. You have to learn to do it. You have to master the technique. The Chinese have had a century to master that. When you put them side by side, you realize that the Koreans have really good color in their cobalt blue. They are still learning the techniques of painting. Now, skip that and go on. I've already told you where the pieces were produced. By the later in the 15th century, 16th century, Koreans were absolute masters of producing pure white porcelain like this. Very little survives because it wasn't collected traditionally in Korea, and in addition, because of all the wars, not just modern, like the Japanese occupation or World War II or the Korean War, but various wars over the centuries. Not too much has survived. But there is a beautiful plain white jar, and here's a stunning masterpiece with a really beautiful cover from the 15th to 16th century period. Now, unlike the Chinese, who, if they decorated the porcelains with underglaze colors, they would either use cobalt blue or occasionally copper red, which would give sort of a strawberry jam color if it turned out right. The Koreans would sometimes decorate their porcelains, not too many of them, but sometimes decorate their porcelains with underglaze iron brown, which can be a very pleasing effect, as you see here. The Chinese had used iron brown on some of their Suzhou wares several centuries earlier, but the Chinese almost never used brown on porcelain, but it can have a very pleasing effect. The other thing I want to introduce here is that even more so than in China, there was a very close relationship between Korean porcelain decoration and contemporaneous painting on paper and silk. When you put those two together, you see the relationship there. It is said that the king, for things being produced for the court, sent painters from the Royal Painting Academy to the kilns to teach the potters how to paint in this particular sort of literati fashion. In addition, gave them copybooks, if you will, of designs that they could follow. This is also typical when we move into the 17th or into the 18th century, a different approach to the overall decoration. When we think about Chinese ceramics of the period, porcelains with blue, this and that, we think of elaborate borders. We think of a kind of decoration that goes around the entire piece. Decoration that's probably symmetrical, for example. Now look at this. There are no borders. It is an asymmetrical but perfectly balanced design. Where did that come from? Well, look here. Look at the one over there on the right. And you put them side by side, and that particular painting, it wasn't, but it could have been the model for the decoration that we see on this particular jar. Like I said, even more so than in China, a very close relationship between Korean painting and Korean porcelains. This, by contrast, is what the Chinese were producing. Equally beautiful, but a very different approach. Decoration over the entire piece, very assertive decoration, very assertive borders. Side by side, and you suddenly realize, again, as with the celadons, Koreans might have learned from the Chinese, but once they mastered the art, they made it their own and transformed it to meet their own aesthetic needs. These days, there's much interest in these so-called moon jars. This one was offered at Christie's a few weeks ago and sold for $4.6 million US. Now, these were not traditionally collected. They only became popular, quote unquote, in the second half of the 20th century. The price, if you have a little one, you won't retire to Florida by selling it. To have a big price, they have to be really big jars. But they're simply large, plain white, undecorated jars called moon jars because the jar, its shape resembles the full moon. But also, when it was freshly fired, it didn't have any of the marks of wear that you see there. And it was thought that its radiance resembled the moonlight coming from a full moon. And so once again, a popularity of pure white jars with no decoration. Some of you are familiar with Lucy Rie, the Austrian English potter, who became very, very famous. She admired these. That was her particular moon jar, and she gave it to the British Museum some years ago. But now, working with porcelain, of course, Koreans in the 18th century revived the blue and white tradition, moved sort of away from painting with underglaze iron brown. Again, often there is no decoration, a sprig of bamboo against an otherwise unembellished ground. A jar like that might have been used for wine at a wedding ceremony like this, a similar jar with two little cups down there, but in some cases they were used as flower vases. I will zoom in on this particular painting, on that area right there, closer and closer, and there, oops, what did I do? There you see a similar bottle or vase with flowers in it, very similar to the one there. So they had multiple functions, but the blue and white pieces, there you go. Again, even in the 18th century, there are close correspondence between the porcelains and paintings. Put those side by side, and that particular painting, again, seemingly could have served as a model for the decoration on the square wine bottle. The dragon jars, of course, are a great favorite from the 18th century. Very typical type of jar. This bulging shoulder jar evolved from the old Mei-byung vessel, or Mei-ping in Chinese, of the Koryo dynasty, but it becomes much larger, much broader shoulders. On the one hand, they were storage jars, but on the other hand, they also served as vases, sometimes in a situation like this, other times in big festivals and ceremonies, you would have a jar like that holding a very large bouquet, as you see there. They're beautifully painted with cobalt, very detailed, as you can see there. These types of jars are unique to Korea, but they're quite ubiquitous throughout Korea in the 18th and 19th centuries. A few of them are more pictorial, not just dragon, but this one in the Rockefeller collection is a very beautiful one, with a crane descending under pine trees at night with the moon shining brightly there. And when you look very closely, you realize that the preferred blue with the Korean blue and white pieces is a very pale silvery blue instead of the emphatic dark royal blue that we get with many Chinese ceramics. This is about as colorful as Joseon Dynasty porcelains become. They don't use overglazed enamels. Remember, the emphasis on the white, as we saw in the robes and in some of the pure white pieces. This is using underglazed cobalt for the lotus leaves and underglazed copper red for the lotus blossom. Now, this is all not part of the original piece. Something stored on the inside somehow seeped through and discolored the exterior. Or something like this is also about as colorful as you get in these porcelains, with underglazed blue used for the grass-like leaves, underglazed iron brown used for the chrysanthemum leaves over there, and then underglazed copper red for the chrysanthemum blossoms there. By contrast, look at this piece in the Walters. This was the taste in China. For just as much color, expand the palette as far as possible. And so it's not a matter of technique or ability. It's simply a very, very major difference in taste. The taste for the very beautiful cobalt blue, this shade of cobalt blue, continues into the 19th century, often, again, a spray of bamboo with no borders whatsoever. They would also sometimes produce blue pieces like this. The Chinese used blue glazes, where cobalt was mixed with the otherwise colorless glaze. In Korea, instead of mixing the cobalt with the glaze, they wanted to create some type of pattern, and they did it by painting the cobalt onto the surface of the piece before the glaze was applied. So it's underglazed cobalt, and then with a clear glaze on top with that particular effect. This interest in open work designs continues in vessels too. It's a brush pot, so it didn't have to contain liquids, and they were able to have a brush pot for the scholar's desk decorated with an open work pattern of banana palm leaves, as you see there. Here's a wonderful dragon on a brush pot with open work designs and a little bit of cobalt blue. And these are the last couple of slides that I will show you. There becomes an interest in using the blue, having the decoration rise up in very slight relief. It's an auspicious pattern of pines, deer, bamboo, and such. Of course, it's molded. They rise up in relief. Then the background has been tinted with cobalt blue and a clear glaze put over that. Or in this case, looking something like a treble, but it seems to be completely independent of that in terms of its shape. But another wine bottle where the decorative elements rise in relief and the background is tinted with copper red. So we're at the end of the lecture. This is just to remind you of the differing tastes between the Goryeo dynasty, the lushness that we see there, and the somewhat austerity that we see in presentation in the Joseon period, and the same thing in the ceramics. Of course, we went over time. What do you expect? I'm lecturing. But I hope this is given, it is an Orient Express through the history of Korean ceramics. I hope that you have some idea of the way the tradition developed and some of the major monuments and how development in each period could lay the foundation for what would come next. Now, if the powers that be permit us, since I've gone over time, we can take a few questions. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Before I get to your questions, forgive me, I know this is very inelegant, but my mouth is dry and I'm thirsty. Okay, now, yes, please.
Okay, thank you. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
I just learned about in Japan how flower arranging is an art that's been studied over the centuries. And so what I'd like to know here is, were there certain vases in Korea for flower arranging? What ones would you want to have if you could afford this?
You say flowers in particular?
Yes.
And the cultivation of flowers. Yes, there are all kinds of flowers. Of course, Buddhism was always very, not Buddhism, the lotus that goes along with Buddhism was very, very popular. The lotus was native to China as well as India and many parts of the world, and probably native to Korea too. We don't see it too much, the lotus, before the rise of Buddhism in China and Korea. But once it was introduced, the lotus in some ways became the most popular of all flowers. Doesn't mean that every time that you see a lotus, it has something to do with Buddhism when you see it in the arts, but it means that it was a very auspicious flower. Other preferred flowers would be the chrysanthemum, as we saw many times. Orchids, of course, were very popular. Peonies were very popular. So those are flowers that were cultivated, but they also occur in the arts. There are others as well, but the lotus, chrysanthemum, peony, and orchid, those were the usual favorites. Other questions? Sorry, if I don't see you, in order to accommodate this microphone, which is over my ear, I took my glasses off because the earpiece and the glasses don't play well together. So if I don't see you, it's because I'm sort of blind. But now that I know who you are, go ahead. Actually, instead of raising your hand, just stand up if there are more questions. Yes?
Forgive my ignorance, but was all
Take the microphone a little ways away from your mouth.
Was all of the ceramics hand-built, or were they on wheels? Like the square ones I would assume were built by hand, but the cylindrical ones, were they built on a wheel?
Yes, virtually all of the Korean ceramics, Chinese ceramics too for that matter, most of them were turned on the wheel. The square bottles that I showed you, well, like that square bottle right there, that would have been so-called slab construction, where you make slabs and put them together. But most of the pieces were turned on the wheel. Now, if they have molded decoration, it doesn't mean necessarily that the entire piece was molded. That's hard to do because when you do it, you try to take the mold apart and parts of the piece stick to the mold and you've lost everything. No, those with molded decoration, like that one bowl that I showed you, the profile and the interior, the piece would have been shaped on the potter's wheel, then it would have been placed over a mold, pushed against the mold to transfer the decoration and then gently removed from the mold. There was a brief period in China in the early 15th century, Xuanda periods, when they did use so-called press molds. But I think they found so many technical difficulties, not of shaping the pieces, not of creating the molds, but separating the molds without destroying the pieces at the end, that they gave it up. So things that obviously have been to some extent shaped or decorated with a mold, it means it was probably turned on the wheel and then a mold used to impart decoration. Yes? Come on, I didn't answer. Are there questions from the balcony? Yes, someone in the back. Okay. I knew I couldn't have answered all your questions.
Okay, so the question is just, it relates more to the potters themselves. Were there ones who sort of they raise in status as their technical proficiency was increased? Were there sort of like a star class of those who were making the more sought after pieces, if that makes sense?
Again, I didn't hear exactly, and so I will give you the answer to the question I think you asked. And if it's not the right question, forgive me. Of course, one did not just, whether in China or any place in the traditional world, China, Korea, Japan, Europe, any place, you'd not just choose to be a potter as one might do today. You were probably born into a family of potters when you were little, and these were not one potter making one pot. It was a whole operation, a little factory, if you will. And in some cases a very large factory with many different families involved in its operations. But you were born into a family of potters. When you were little, you would have been taken into the studios and told to clean the floor and do this and other little errands and chores and things like that. As you grew, you would begin to learn how to make pots, and if you showed some technical ability or some aptitude for shaping pots on a wheel, maybe you would grow into be one who became a potter who shaped pieces. If you had no ability at that, but maybe you had some ability in incising, carving, or painting decoration, you might go on and learn all of that, and that would become your métier, if you will. If you had no talent at all, you would be carrying firewood and the rest of your life, that kind of thing. But keep in mind, this was a large operation. When I was young, you're all too young to remember of any of this, but when I was young, we used to read in the Encyclopedia Britannica and such that Henry Ford invented the assembly line. Nonsense. There was an assembly line type of production, not with an actual moving line, but assembly line type of production in China already by 1400 BC. The kilns were operating that way in China. The kilns were operating that way in Korea, as they would to some extent in Japan. What I'm saying is that there was a very high degree of specialization of labor. One did not make a whole pot. We know it's hard to know from Korea and hard to know from most periods in China, but we do have records from China from the Ming Dynasty stating that with the production of porcelains for the imperial household, that a piece might have passed through the hands of, say, 100 different people during the course of its manufacture. There are those who worked the clay, purified it, worked air bubbles out of the clay and things like that. There were those who shaped the piece on the potter's wheel. Somebody else who, after it had been shaped, you don't shape the whole thing. Somebody has to come along and cut the foot ring so it's precisely shaped in just the right height. Somebody else, without too much talent, but a talent for not dropping things, would carry a whole plank of pots that had been shaped off for them to be dried. And then after drying, they were ready to be decorated. So if they're going to be incised or carved, you have master carvers and master incisors. If they're going to be painted, you have ones who paint. But even then, one person doesn't do all the design, whether carving, painting, whatever. There would be those who specialized in borders, those who specialized in the principal decorative motif on the piece. Then there were those who had to get them out to dry again. There were those who prepared the glaze slurry, ones who dipped the pieces in the glaze, somebody carrying them again. Then a whole operation that tended to the kilns. Pieces in the kiln tended to the firing, which was critical because you had to have the right atmosphere in the kiln, but also the right temperature. And remember, the firing could go on, depending on the size of the piece, the firing could go on for a couple of days. And so it had to be handled exactly right, or you wouldn't end up with anything like the ceramics that we've been looking, whether China, Korea, Japan, or any part of the world. So in no sense was it one person, one pot, start to finish. But it means that they were trained generation to generation to generation. Born into a family of potters, you learned from the time you were a child, and as you grew up and showed talent for this or no talent for anything, your fate would be decided. I don't think that's quite what you asked, but that's all I could make of it. Okay, I am told that we've reached our time limit, and that's my fault for going over time, but I hope I presented a little bit about the arts of Korea, ceramics of Korea. What fun, my pleasure.
It was not just a little bit, but it was really a wonderful hop, skip, and a jump, but really a learned hop, skip, and a jump. So I now feel like
that.
I know, but I feel like I know quite a bit about it. I hope that, will you be staying for a little while? Or
Yes,
do you
I'll
have
stay for the reception.
Great, so he will be at the reception, and if you have another question or a precision that you would like on the question that you asked, please come and enjoy with us on level 1 lobby, and we will look forward to seeing you there, and also on the 4th floor. Thank you so much, and once again this year, thank you, John and Barrett, for such an incredible treat that we have, thanks to you. Thank you.
And thank all of you.